My name is Birgit Schneider. I'm living in Berlin, Germany. I'm a scholar in media and cultural studies, and my research is dealing with climate change images and climate change imaginaries in culture and science. And I'm working at the University of Potsdam. The reason for the following interview is the pressing question of our time of what we can do better or differently in climate change communication. And to discuss this question, we invited several speakers. And it was important to us to juxtapose voices from various fields of studies and also to combine perspectives from different countries. And my guest for this interview is Axel Gelfert. He's a professor for theoretical philosophy at the Technical University in Berlin. And one of his many research focuses is, his research focus is the philosophy of technology and technoscience and the philosophy of science. So he is interested in how knowledge is produced. And here, in this regard, he also looks at scientific models. Welcome, Axel Gelfert.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
I would like to start with this idea of the sciences, the natural sciences. In their ideal form, we could say it's a systematic process to produce facts and rational statements of truth, which are objective and neutral. And why is science nevertheless, as you point out, also a messy and incomplete process? So what is our perspective on science?
Well, I think science is in the business of generating truths. It does so through social processes, and whenever you have social processes involved, there will be interests, there will be outlooks, there will be perspectives. And one of the successes of the sciences, as I see it, is that in spite of all this diversity, science is broadly converging locally and partially on consensus, on truths about the world that wouldn't have been readily obvious from first-hand experience. So I think what we need to realize is that when science is called messy or incomplete, that's not denigrating science. It's actually a sign of the successful pursuit of science. So science is a social enterprise. It's not just any social enterprise. It's the social enterprise that generates truths about the world. And what I think sometimes gets missing in science communication is that we should celebrate the messiness and the successes of science as a result of all this complexity. Science is not just a way of generating declared truths that then seem obvious. Science is in the business of pursuing the unobvious truths. And we should give scientists and sometimes ourselves a bit more credit for what science can achieve.
And you say it's a social process. Science is a social process. And of course, we want to talk about how non-expert audiences are perceiving science, climate science, in this interview. The British professor Mike Hume argued in his book, Why We Disagree About Climate Change. He says, the sources of our disagreement with climate change lie deep within us, in our values and our sense of identity and purpose. And he writes, they do not reside out there, you could say, in some ultimate physical reality. So there's this idea that there's no way to grasp this physical reality as a whole, as such. What is the social or the cultural idea of that climate change, the sources of disagreement with climate change science lie deep within us?
I think it's a very good point. I think it points to a special challenge that climate science is facing with respect to what one might call an empiricist idea of science. A lot of portrayals, popular portrayals of science, often from scientists themselves, basically starts with the assumption that science is organized common sense. We make observations, we generate inductively hypotheses, which we then go out and test, all of which is done by scientists, by individuals, using their expert training and their observational capacities. And that somehow through this process, we aggregate results and we develop scientific theories, for example. And that's by and large okay as an understanding of science, but it doesn't really reflect what's going on in the case of climate science. And in some sense, the tragedy of climate science is that it seems to be dealing with something which we experience firsthand every day. We look out the window, it's an autumn afternoon here in Berlin, it's a mild drizzle. These are data, this is data that's firsthand available to me. It can be assessed to me, but that's not what climate is all about. Climate isn't weather. And I think a lot of the misunderstanding that one gets and a lot of the attacks on climate science that we sometimes get come from this conflation of weather and climate. If we think about climate as aggregate weather over very long time scales, 20, 30 years, and then we have to average out precipitation, temperature, sunshine, what have you, then we're dealing with quantities and variables that are no longer readily accessible through first-hand sense data. And that's something which is not immediately obvious to the proverbial man in the street. So I think there's often a dismissal of climate science on the basis that it seems to be dealing with something that we think we have expertise on, first-hand experience of, but it actually takes a lot of expertise to understand what the climate is all about.
So do we all have to become experts? It's so complex, we have to say. Do we all need to learn complexity studies, chaos theory, the differences of statistical weather and climate and tipping points? And would you also follow this idea of a knowledge deficit model here?
I think that would be exactly the wrong conclusion to draw. One of the beauties of science is that it is a social enterprise that is structured around division of labor and division of epistemic labor. So we have different experts who have their special capacities, and they are in the position to generate knowledge, to convey knowledge. And we have to rely on that as members of the general public, and scientists themselves have to rely on the expertise of others. And of course, it would be futile to try to gain and develop expertise in every single area in which we want science to give us answers. It wouldn't be possible within a human lifetime. And it's fortunately not necessary, because there are indirect ways in which we can assess the expertise of putative experts. By using proxies, we can use certain qualities that indicate the presence of expertise. We do that all the time. Every time you go to a medical doctor and you look one up in any directory, you're going to buy certain credentials that this doctor has acquired. And similarly, in the case of scientists, we have organized forms of training of scientists. We credential them, we give them PhDs, we have institutions that are solely devoted to developing this kind of expert knowledge. And so all we need to do, and that's tongue-in-cheek because it's still a very difficult thing to do, all we need to do is assess whether these markers of expertise are reliable. What we find, unfortunately, is that as with all proxies and all indicator qualities that aren't the real thing, if expertise is the real thing, we can only access expertise through these indicator qualities of credentials and so forth. They are fallible. They can, of course, also be simulated. And so if we take a step or a leap to one of the pertinent problems in the communication of climate change and the study of climate change, namely climate denialism, we find that some climate deniers have developed infrastructures of credentialing. They have think tanks that have serious sounding names, but they basically have made it up. And they are using institutional affiliations that they themselves have created to sometimes obfuscate the fact that they are not experts in the field that they claim to be experts about.
Mm-hmm. So this would be an explanation why why science and public in some countries are so far apart on scientific issues. I just give some numbers, and they change every year, of course. So. There are different polls, like climate change concern only 50% of the US citizens, 41%. One poll said Republicans don't believe in climate change. In Germany, it's only 17%. And then again, the consensus of science in a general, science people, all scientists is 87%, and climate scientists, we all know this number of 97%. So, would it be good to have the numbers, like the same numbers, if there was a great success would it be a great success if we had a 100% consensus on this topic?
The question of consensus and dissent in science is a tricky one. I mean, diversity of viewpoints and some degree of dissent in science is a necessary precondition for scientific innovation. But of course, that does not mean that holding on to outdated views that have been disproven by empirical evidence somehow contributes to the positive utility of diversity in science. So while it's true that we need dissent in science, it doesn't. The fact that this is a precondition for scientific change and scientific innovation doesn't mean that just any form of dissent thereby is either rational or a contribution to scientific progress. And I think in the case of climate change and the science of climate change, we have reached a consensus, let's not forget, not on details, but on the overarching background fact that there is anthropogenic climate change. Exactly how anthropogenic climate change will play out is something about which there is a lot of micro dissent, if you like, in science, depending on which models people use, which simulations they've developed. Precisely how climate change will play out is a matter of active scientific debate. So when one refers to the scientific consensus, it's not that this is a coherent, monolithic set of beliefs. It's not a monolithic belief system, but it's basically adherence to certain broadly supported causal structures. And I think that's what's important to realize. In fact, dissent in science exists and should give us confidence in agreement where it does exist, namely on, for example, the fact that anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions are a major, perhaps the major driver of climate change as we are already observing it today.
Mm-hmm. In your field of study, terms like cultural cognition play a great role, but also the cognitive dissonance concept. Can you tell us something about it?
Mm-hmm. The cultural cognition thesis I can illustrate by using the example you just gave of the heavily politicized nature of views on climate in the United States. So when you said that much smaller portion of Republicans in the United States believes in climate change as compared with registered Democrats, that shows that what ought to be the neutral topic of climate change has somehow been hijacked by cultural, political, ideological affiliations. Once a particular topic is seen as ideological or heavily politicized or integral to someone's identity, that is something which is then difficult to overcome. And people basically try to preserve the integrity of their belief system by processing information and evidence very selectively. So take an example, belief in the free market is obviously a crucial bit of someone's worldview. So if someone believes in the free market as an ideal, as of course many Republicans in the United States would, it's part of Republican political worldview if you wish, then any information that challenges this free market ideal is likely to be assessed more negatively than information that would support it. So and it doesn't take much to recognize that the challenges of climate change will probably require heavy regulation. So government interference, some degree of regulation. That information then becomes unpalatable to those who believe in the free market ideal, and they will be more likely to dismiss it. And so cultural cognition, as I have sort of presented a caricature here, is basically the thesis that all information is processed through the lens of cultural background beliefs.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the idea of a filter bubble, as it's called in the media today, is helpful? And what would this mean to you? And in our age of social media, is there something special about filtering cognitive dissonances?
The idea of the filter bubble is, of course, much discussed in recent years. When it was first proposed by Pariser, it was, I think, a little overstated. There isn't all that much evidence that collectively, on the whole, we or each of us lives in a filter bubble. I mean, the idea being that we are only confronted with information that is pre-selected, for example, by algorithms on the basis of our previous interactions with social media. Empirical research shows that filter bubbles aren't a problem for everyone, but they do show that there is what one might call fringe filter bubbles, that there is basically self-radicalization in certain portions of society. So once people narrow the field of opinions and interlocutors they encounter, there is a risk that they will be exposed through these self-learning algorithms that are special to social media these days, to information that already confirms what their preferences are. And that, I think, is a real risk. So if there's something novel about social media, it's not that there is bias or that there is alignment of interest. That has always existed. In the past, we might have had more conservative newspapers and we had more liberal newspapers, and people would presumably buy the ones that they would agree with more. But even with a newspaper, you're always confronted with a selection of topics. You open the newspaper, or if you have a physical copy of the newspaper, there was no way of avoiding being exposed to things that weren't matched and linked up and aligned with one's preferences. In the age of social media, with self-learning algorithms, there's a much greater risk of having essentially tailored information that is tailored to the specific profile, sometimes a profile that isn't even obvious and readily evident to the person themselves. It's a profile that the algorithm has inferred from previous interactions. What did people click on? What did they like? And let's basically put out more information that will generate more interaction or more engagement on social media. Mm-hmm. So I think social media accelerates an existing dynamic, and it adds a new dimension because it tailors information to the specific demands of the individual. We're no longer dealing with segments of a public or a multiplicity of publics. We are dealing with information that is basically put out there to cater to the specific interests of a single individual. That's something new. That's something that needs to be addressed. It doesn't mean that we all live in a filter bubble, but it does mean that we need to pay a lot more attention to the biases and the dynamics of algorithms.
Of course, we have to talk about how do we actually step out of the boxes that are limiting our perception. And actually, I like the image of a soap bubble, because it's a spherical view of our perception. And we can now think about how to expand our radius. And Greg Fishel, was a well-known TV meteorologist of the US, and who, after years of doubting anthropogenic climate change, actually re-evaluated his confirmation biases, and he started acknowledging the science of anthropogenic climate change, and admitted that he had only accepted information of what he already thought. So what do you think? How do we step out of the boxes? And I'm aware that we are both not from the solutions department, but from the questions department. But still, I want to pose this question.
The case you've discussed is an interesting one because it kind of embodies an ideal version of events where someone, if I understand the case correctly, changed their view in the light of scientific evidence. So he started looking at those reports, and the reports somehow rang true, and he went perhaps even through some data, given that he had some background training as a meteorologist, and realized this is not made up, this is not a sort of bogus problem, this is something very real. Unfortunately, the mere facts alone don't always speak for themselves, and they don't speak in particular to people who have already deeply held beliefs that would be challenged by those scientific facts. The kind of cultural cognition problem or thesis that we just talked about. How should one go about communicating information? Well, we should try to create situations that make it easy for people to encounter scientific evidence. That doesn't mean that we have to talk down to people and have to sort of somehow dilute the scientific problems that do exist. That doesn't mean that we have to somehow exaggerate the scientific consensus on the smaller point, but it does mean that we need to drive home the message that there is a scientific and a well-founded scientific consensus on the fundamental relationships between humans, emissions, and climate. Some of this can be done very effectively, I think, through using analogies. So in communication, we can make the case that knowledge of certain basic relationships in climate science is no different in quality or character than basic knowledge in certain areas of physics. You don't have to know exactly how a satellite works in order to accept the fact that the Earth is round. Satellites move around it and communicate information about what's going on in space or on Earth. So we simply, as a matter of fact, in everyday life, constantly defer to experts for good reasons. And I think creating conditions that enable people to see for themselves that this is no different in terms of the science that's being done than other areas of science that they do exist can basically create a kind of continuity with their experiences. That's something we can do. What we can also do is encourage people like the person you've mentioned who has changed his view and has basically returned to a scientifically rational assessment of the evidence to speak out about it and speak out about the experiences that made them change their minds. So that means taking into account the kind of audiences that we talk to without, and that's important, without somehow falsifying or exaggerating the scientific data that exists. Because what we certainly wouldn't want is people being given somehow biased data. I don't think it's recommendable or advisable to tailor information so specifically to target audiences that the target audiences would rightly feel manipulated. We have to basically reach out and make it easy for people to overcome, if this is the problem, to overcome their deeply held ideological beliefs that stand in the way of a proper assessment, a proper rational assessment of the scientific evidence.
Mm-hmm. So science communicators must get experts on the belief systems of their targeted groups, in a way? Is this something you would recommend?
I think that any science communicator these days would be well advised to take the findings of social psychology seriously and perhaps even collaborate with expert psychologists of communication, where the goal is not, and I repeat, is not to manipulate the audiences, it's to open up previously closed off avenues of communication, to get people to take in the full range of scientific evidence, because the scientific evidence as it presents itself is so overwhelming and is so cohesive and coherent that it simply does not allow for any other conclusion than the ones that are the consensus view when it comes to the big points about is there anthropogenic climate change or not. Yes, there is. Svante Arrhenius was worried about it in the 19th century. Lyndon B. Johnson in the 1960s gave a speech to the US Congress talking about how this generation has changed the climate in ways like no other generation before. This has been, we've had 50 plus years of scientific consensus, and even, if you take the LBJ example, of political consensus on the issue. So it's kind of ironic or sad or tragic rather that we still frame the question as an existence claim, is there or is there not anthropogenic climate change? It's happening right under our nose. We need to get people to realize, to ask different questions. How does it affect people's life worlds? Because deep down, most people, I would hazard a guess, most people have some inkling, some perhaps not quite explicit awareness of the changes that are unfolding, whether it is the absence of cold winters or it is droughts, or it is other weather patterns that have changed that may not be 100% attributable to climate change yet, but we need to basically speak to people's experiences as science communicators.
And you're propagating scenarios as a vehicle to get thinking into movement and maybe to expand the radius also for people who think in other ways than climate change. Why do you think that scenarios would be a good way for communicating climate change?
Now, scenarios is a very global term that that I've used to capture a wide range of projections and descriptions of possible climate futures. It's a term that is, of course, not a new term. It's something which climate scientists use all the time. But often enough in the past, climate scenarios were mere baseline scenarios, asking what will happen if, for example, CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere double, a very, very important sort of placeholder for the science of climate change to see what happens in the future. But scenarios need to be enriched because we have, of course, trajectories and socioeconomic factors that play a role beyond mere emissions trajectories. So baseline scenarios only tell us so much. What we need to look at is an integration of all the factors that play a role in people's and societies, how they deal with climate change. So that's one way of thinking about scenarios, moving beyond mere projections of what if the status quo continues for another 30, 40 years. We need to factor in how socioeconomic systems are responsive to changes that will inevitably unfold because they have already begun unfolding. And we need to then, I think, also break down these enriched scenarios into more small-scale narratives that people can deal with. That's why I think that when it comes to popular thinking about climate change, the science communication is one thing, but the influence on the cultural imagination is quite another and equally important thing. So we've witnessed in recent years a rise of climate fiction, not just in literary form, but also through films, movies, and generally an acceptance of the fact of climate change in how people and how societies make sense of the changes that are in store for us. And scenarios, I think, are really important to because they allow people to think about the consequences. They're also important because the science of climate change is not just a scientific question. Climate change is also a moral question. Now, talking about the moral of climate change or the ethical dimension is something which isn't easy because it becomes quickly very uncomfortable, especially for us as inhabitants of Western industrialized nations. But climate scenarios and climate narratives and climate fiction even, I think they allow people to think through the consequences that climate change will have or would have, depending which course of actions we take, for other people like them, but also people unlike them. So I think that there's the promise of broadening you could call it circles of sympathy, that we can empathize with the future generations or representatives of those future generations, how they will be affected by climate change, or with people living very different lives in different parts of the world.
So scenarios, as you described them, would be a very powerful way to expand the radius of imagination and thinking about time frames in a different way, because normally we are not used to think about the next decades or the year 2100, etc. And I really like how you also address the fiction here, because as philosopher Elena Esposito has argued, in an age of risk evaluations, probabilities and uncertainties, she argues all future scenarios are fictional, and that is not to be confused with unrealistic, of course. So the status of these possible futures, and I think this is also true for scenarios, which of course have to be fictional in a way, because it's about telling the futures and possible futures, so you have to really think about a space which normally you cannot be sure about, but still it holds in the here and now, and it's a trajectory, a pathway from the here and now. And maybe also this method is an imaginative aid to study the effects of certain decisions, but also outcomes of what we are doing without deciding, because not everybody is in the position to decide. So what about the fictitious character of scenarios? How do they play out?
I would perhaps call them fictional or fictitious, but counterfactual, meaning that they are not an educated guess, but they are an assessment of what would happen if. And of course, what would happen if is a question that allows for a range of answers. As you rightly said, it doesn't deny the reality of the underlying dynamic, the underlying sort of causal structures that govern what would happen if something were the case, if we somehow doubled carbon emissions twice more, or if we somehow reduced our carbon emissions. This is something which science, again, engages with a lot and all the time. So projection, coming up with scenarios, developing fictional, in this sense, counterfactual predictions is an important aid to the imagination. I think you're absolutely right about that, and I think that's a key point, that our response to climate change and our way of framing climate change has perhaps been not imaginative enough. It doesn't mean that imagination has to run wild somehow and that we need to only imagine worst case scenarios, although it can be a healthy enterprise to also imagine what would happen if nothing were done about reducing carbon emissions, for example. But we need to basically find ways of enriching and enlarging our collective imagination about how to deal with the problem. The problem isn't going away by us ignoring it. It's also not going to be solved by just staring at numbers. It's thinking creatively about ways of dealing with the issues arising, whether in terms of adaptation or in terms of mitigation. But we should think out of the box. We should recognize that our cultural and socioeconomic systems are contingent. They are not necessary products that cannot be changed. They are essentially contingent historical formations that haven't existed forever and that won't exist forever, and that will at some point change. And they will change for good, and they will change radically. So I think by enlarging our imagination, we have at least a chance of imagining worthwhile, not just worst case, but also potential worthwhile futures for ourselves. I think that's something which climate communication needs to take up, and it's a challenge that we must meet.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the following question, the consequence is to ask in what way scenarios also can be conservative and limiting to our visionary thinking, because if you look at the pathways which are sketched out by the IPCC, by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, you could also ask, couldn't these narratives, these storylines on the social-political axis be more radical, be even more out of the box? Because who's making up these narratives? And maybe also scenarios can be limiting in thinking about possible futures. I don't know if we take into account very profound post-growth theories, for example. Do they happen in these models? I don't know. Can we test them out?
If we look at the mere projections of the IPCC, I can't say for sure exactly when this time scale was first introduced, but it seems like for decades, the scenarios, the projections based on current trends, and that entertain basically a range of possible scenarios from best case to worst case, they all seem to end in the year 2100, as if time comes to an end in the year 2100. That might have seemed a long time away in 1992, or whenever the first and second and third and fourth assessment reports of the IPCC were due. But the year 2100 is barely 80 years away. That's a human lifetime. So a child born today can expect to live until the year 2100, and yet our scientific projections pretend as if the development of climate change stops in the year 2100. That's not the case. So climate change will continue. It will continue, unless we do something significant about it, for many more decades and centuries to come. And so I would even say, when it comes to the time scale, we need to think beyond that. So I think we need to enlarge the temporal dimension, and we also need to, as you rightly said, think beyond the current socioeconomic systems that we need to, of course, presuppose. I mean, that's our starting point, but that doesn't have to be our end point. So socioeconomic changes aren't just going to be reflected in tweaking a variable by a few percentage points of GDP growth here or there. They can and ought to include also structural changes. What would it mean to wean ourselves off our addiction to fossil fuels? What would it mean to have a more localized economy in different parts of the world? I mean, this is something which is extremely difficult to model, but it shouldn't stop people from attempting to imagine such scenarios and imagine them not just in free-floating fictional ways, but in ways that are grounded in what we know about ongoing developments in all these different spheres.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for sharing all your ideas with us.
Well, thanks for the invitation. I very much enjoyed this.